Street Fighter Alpha 2 wasn't just another sequel, it was Capcom refining 2D fighting at its peak. Building on the foundation of the first Alpha, this game brought in deeper mechanics, an expanded roster, and some of the most stylish animations seen in a fighting game at the time. It hit arcades in 1996 and quickly made its way to the home consoles, but not all versions were created equal. The Sega Saturn delivered a near-arcade perfect gameplay. The PlayStation had to make some sacrifices, and somehow, against all odds, the Super Nintendo pulled off one of the most impressive technical feats of the era. Today, we're breaking down Street Fighter Alpha 2 across arcade, Super Nintendo, Saturn, PlayStation, and even Windows, what made it great and which version stands the test of time. Released in 1996, Street Fighter Alpha 2 took everything from the first Alpha and cranked it up. The game featured a refined combo system, custom combos that allowed players to unleash devastating personal attacks, and a roster filled with returning fan favorites like Dalsim and Zangief. It also introduced Evil Ryu, a more aggressive version of Ryu with new moves and a darker backstory. Visually, Alpha 2 was a masterpiece for its time. The CPS2 hardware allowed for smooth character animations, detailed backgrounds, and flashy super moves that felt satisfying to pull off. Compared to other fighters in 1996 like Mortal Kombat or King of Fighters 96, Alpha 2 stood out with its vibrant, hand-drawn art style and responsive controls. This version became the benchmark for all home conversions, but not all ports lived up to the arcade's high standards. Street Fighter Alpha 2 was a standout title in Capcom's legendary fighting game lineup, refining the mechanics of its predecessor and delivering one of the smoothest, most technical experiences in the franchise. While the game shined in arcades, its home console releases tell an interesting story of adaptation, compromise, and technical achievement. So with that being said, let's take a look at how Alpha 2 made its way to different platforms and which version truly delivered the best experience. Starting off with the Saturn version, which happens to be the one that most players would determine to be the definitive way to play this game. The Saturn was built with 2D fighters in mind, featuring powerful sprite handling capabilities and extra RAM for smooth animations. If you wanted an arcade-perfect experience at home in the 90s, this was the version to get. And what made the Saturn port so special was how well it preserved the arcade experience. Unlike the PlayStation version, which had some animation cuts due to memory limitations, the Saturn version retained nearly every frame of animation. The game also loaded faster thanks to the Saturn's architecture being better suited for 2D gaming, so if you were serious about Alpha 2, this was the definitive way to play it outside of the arcade. The Saturn's hardware played a major role in this superior performance. The system featured two Hitachi SH2 processors working in parallel, which allowed for more efficient sprite handling and complex calculations. This dual CPU setup enabled the Saturn to maintain smooth animation and detailed character sprites without sacrificing performance. Additionally, the console's BD2P graphics processor managed background layers separately, ensuring that the game's rich environments remained sharp and dynamic without impacting character movement. Another key advantage of the Saturn version was its responsiveness. The console's hardware allowed for precise input timing, making special moves and combos easier to execute compared to other home versions. As we said before, this is one of the things that made this port the preferred choice for competitive players looking for an experience that stayed as true as possible to the arcade mechanics. You get shorter load times in the Saturn version, which help keep the action flowing. Unlike the PlayStation port, which had noticeable pauses between fights, the Saturn version allowed players to stay immersed in the game with minimal downtime. The Saturn's 6-button controller also provided a more authentic arcade feel compared to the default PlayStation controller, making input smoother and more intuitive. Beyond gameplay, the Saturn version also benefited from superior sound quality. Unlike the PlayStation version, which had occasional compression issues, the Saturn's hardware allowed for clearer and more faithful renditions of the arcade's music and sound effects. I know it may seem like I'm singing this version of the game too high a praise, but when you consider how demanding and complex Street Fighter Alpha 2 was, it's clear why the Saturn version stood out as the best home experience available. The sheer size of the character sprites, the smoothness of the animations, and the intricacies of the game's mechanics required serious hardware to replicate properly, and the Saturn delivered in every way. Now, let's move on to the PlayStation port of the game, which was solid but flawed. And that's not to say that the PlayStation version of Alpha 2 was bad, it simply had noticeable compromises. Due to the system's memory constraints, this version had missing animation frames, which slightly affected the fluidity of the movement and the combos. Load times were also longer than they were on the Saturn, though they were not unbearable. But despite these issues, the gameplay itself still remained strong. If you only had a PlayStation, this was still a great way to experience Alpha 2. It's just that if you compared it side by side with the Saturn versions, the differences were clear. Capcom did the best they could with the PlayStation's limitations, it just quite didn't match the smoothness of the arcade or Saturn releases. Even then, this version of the game managed to sell over 721,000 copies, versus the 403,000 that the Saturn did. Now, the Super Nintendo version, or what we can call a miracle port. The fact that Street Fighter Alpha 2 was even attempted on the SNES is kind of insane. By 1996, the console was nearing the end of its life, with the Nintendo 64 already on the market. Capcom had to get extremely creative to make this work, and they did so by using the SDD1 chip. The chip's main function was data decompression, so it played a huge and essential role in allowing for the Super Nintendo to process the huge amounts of data required for the large character sprites. So this helped Capcom by a lot, but as with the previous version that we discussed, there were some serious trade-offs that were required. The SNES version had fewer frames of animation, which of course made the movements feel a bit choppier compared to the arcade. Some of the sound effects were also downgraded, and the biggest drawback was the brief loading delay before each round, which was a very rare issue for a cartridge-based game. However, despite these limitations, it played surprisingly well. The core mechanics were intact, and the fact that a Street Fighter Alpha game could run on the Super Nintendo at all was nothing short of a technical feat. Something that's very impressive is that this version of the game wasn't just a bare-bones port, it included all the characters and retained the custom combos, which is something that could have easily been cut due to hardware limitations. If you grew up playing this version, you were experiencing a true underdog success story. There's a version of this game that is often overlooked, and that is the Windows version, or as we like to call it, the Forgotten port. While it was technically a solid port, it just didn't gain much traction because most PC gamers at the time weren't focused on fighting games. Unlike today, where you have arcade sticks and optimized settings for PC fighters, back in the late 90s, most people were playing on keyboards and with subpar controllers, which made the experience less appealing. If you had the right setup though, this was a good way to play Alpha 2 with arcade-level visuals. So in conclusion, Street Fighter Alpha 2 was one of Capcom's best fighters of the 90s, and its various home releases show just how much effort went into keeping the game alive across different hardware. From the near-perfect Saturn version to the miracle Super Nintendo port, each version of the game has its own story. But now I want to hear from you. Did you grow up playing Alpha 2 on the SNES? Or were you all about that Saturn experience? Or perhaps you had the PS1 version? Let me know in the comments and tell us which of the other Capcom fighting games from the 90s you think deserves more attention. If you enjoyed the content, give us a follow and check out some of our other game and anime spotlights.